Suburban Sentinel here, taking a break from my mundane yard duties, including cutting up the tree that came down in a hurricane. Oh, God, must be a year and a half, 2 years ago now. Last night I was going through some old photo albums and I ran across some pictures of the boys and one of our mentors from the old days. Guy's name was Jumpin Jim. God rest his soul, he was a hell of a guy. He was a World War II vet, a B-17 pilot in Europe, and a 25 mission one at that. My first career was as a pilot, and old Jumpin Jim, he was one of the head instructors at the place I went to school. And although sometimes it seemed that old Jumpin Jim was just a sadistic SOB, he was a great guy and he was doing everything he could to make sure that we stayed alive. One of the things that Jumpin Jim did for us is that every month he would find every pilot he knew that was still in the area and bring all of us together, what he called the round table. The round table was nothing more than a collection of pilots from every walk of life, civilian, military, crop dusters, airline pilots, at every experience level. And we would sit around and have dinner and talk about flying. And although it was a lot of fun, there was an underlying educational element to it. Jim really emphasized us swapping stories and accounts of things that happened to us so that we could learn from each other without making the same mistakes. His philosophy was, it's great to learn from your own mistakes, but it's even better to learn from someone else's, because some of the mistakes that are made in the aviation industry are fatal. Of course, the old round table days were before there was email or internet or YouTube or any of this stuff. And we learned from each other. Even in those small groups, it made a big difference in people's lives. So I got to thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to do something similar in the gun community, more of a virtual round table where we could learn from each other based on our personal experiences. So this video is an experiment in a roundtable discussion about an experience involving firearms. Cutting down this tree reminded me of this experience because this particular situation involved firearms and a chainsaw. Getting back to old Jumpin Jim for just a moment, one of the lessons he continually beat into us, and I mean literally beat into us, he loved hitting us on the top of the head with his clipboard. He was a big stressor of situational awareness. Those two words came out of his mouth hundreds of times a day. Essentially, Jumpin Jim's lesson was always be aware of your situation, constantly question, monitor, and analyze, because if you're responding to a faulty assumption about your situation, your chances of responding successfully are quite minimal. For about 15 years, I was doing some freelance work for the government. And as part of this gig, on occasion, I would have to go to a private property, whether it was a home or a commercial building, factory, warehouse, whatever, and sit in front of the building and tell people who came by at a pre-appointed time for an auction that the auction was canceled. It was a pretty silly thing to have to do because, one, it was a very rare occasion when anybody actually showed up. And two, I could just have easily have posted a sign saying auction canceled. But anyway, the rules, which were incredibly inflexible, required that I stay there for 3 hours to tell any interested parties that they could go home. Oftentimes, these auctions were held in high crime urban areas, and occasionally there was some trouble. It didn't happen often, but often enough. Funny thing was that if the non-event was to take place in a high crime area, we were permitted to ask for police assistance. So we were required to get a private duty officer and mail the police department a check for a not insignificant amount. I think it was $250 or $275 to have public police protection at private expense. And that would have been okay, except what happened to me the first 3 times I had one of these non-events in a bad area is I sent the cops in the check, which they cashed, and then the police didn't show up. So I'd call the station and they would, who are you? What are you talking about? You know, call back next week. So after that, I just said, how the hell with it? Just wasting a couple $100 every time I do this. So a few years ago, I had to go to one of these non-events to tell people who weren't going to show up to go home. And this particular auction was being held in a very, very rough part of the city, not far from the bucolic surroundings you see here. I had done this kind of thing in that same neighborhood a few times over the years, and on one occasion some joker took a few pot shots at me from a window somewhere. I think he was just trying to scare me because it didn't come anywhere close, but it still really put me on edge. The policy was we were not supposed to be armed in any way, but then again the policy was we were supposed to have police protection if we reasonably thought we need it. So I said, the hell with the policies. I went with a 1911 and my .357 Magnum. It was a real hot, humid day in early August, and I planned to sit in the car the whole time, and at least for the first 2 hours just have the windows open, and by 11, because I started I think at 9, to throw the AC on and just roll the windows up. This particular non-event happened to be on a Saturday morning in a urban but residential neighborhood. I was hoping that, you know, a lazy summer Saturday, that at the stroke of noon I'd be gone and no one would have even realized I was even there. For I'd say the first 45 minutes or so, it was dead quiet, and I was pretty happy about that, hoping that I could get through the rest of the morning without incident. And I guess it was about 11:15 or so. I see a guy walking down the street, same side of the street, towards me, where I was parked sitting in the car. And as he got closer, I was taken aback by his attire. He was wearing a hat, which is certainly not unusual for a warm summer morning, but he was also wearing a very heavy, it looked like a mechanic's sweater, something you would wear when it's in the high 30s, low 40s. And by this time it was already about 80, 85 degrees out. And this guy's wearing a heavy sweater. And as he approached even further, I noticed that that was all he was wearing. He wasn't wearing any pants, he wasn't wearing any shoes, wasn't wearing any underwear. And as he came by the car, he was grinning from ear to ear, had this 1,000-yard stare, apparently unaware he was literally half naked, or not caring. I don't know what he was on or what his story was, but he kept walking, and I don't even think he realized I was there, even though he wasn't more than 2 feet away from the car. And I was kind of laughing about it. You know, I hope this is the biggest event of the day. So that guy went on his merry way, and time kept passing, although at an excruciatingly slow pace. And now it was after 11, and it was really starting to get hot. So I started the car, turned the AC on, and put the windows up. And just after I had done that, I heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw engine starting. And it was coming from the backyard of the house directly across the street from where I was parked. And I thought, gee, that's really unusual, because this is very much an urban neighborhood. There are occasional trees here and there, but it's not the kind of thing that people would have chainsaws around and they would be pruning or cutting trees. So I heard the chainsaw going for probably 4 or 5 minutes and didn't really think too much about it. And then all of a sudden, the saw noise started getting closer. Then I see a guy emerge from the side of the house carrying the chainsaw. And I hear the chainsaw, rumbling along. And I'm kind of looking at him, and he comes down towards the front of the property and towards the road. And I see him, and he's headed directly for my car. Fortunately, the streets in that neighborhood are rather wide. So he was still a good 75 or 80 feet away when he had my full attention. Now, I was really on edge. Again, someone had taken just a few pot shots at me a couple of years before that. And back in the late 70s, early 80s, that neighborhood was like the Wild West. Seemed like there were almost nightly shootings, murders, etc., etc. Now here comes this guy approaching the car with a chainsaw very much like the one you see here on camera in his hands. And he is approaching the car rather quickly. So now thoughts are racing through my head. Okay, the windows are up, the doors are locked, but that saw blade could go through my side window like it was cardboard. So now the guy is about 15 feet from the side window of the car and approaching. And I grabbed the 1911 that I had tucked into the mat pocket in the driver's door. And I pulled it out, put it in my right hand, put my elbow on the driver's door, and the 1911 was cocked and locked, and I flipped the safety off. And I had the slide sticking up just above my arm. Now, I've never been in the military, never served in law enforcement or anything like that, and never fired a shot in anger. But I distinctly remember at that point going, holy crap, this could be for real. Then, just like clockwork, the guy was maybe 3 or 4 feet from the window, and I heard Jumpin Jim's voice, situational awareness, situational awareness. And all the things I've heard about target fixation were true. I couldn't take my eyes off that guy or the chainsaw. Although I was looking intently at him, I didn't really understand what was going on. And finally, at the last second, as I put my finger onto the trigger of that 1911 that was unlocked and ready to fire, I realized that the chainsaw was no longer running. Just as the guy with the chainsaw raised his other hand to knock on the window, I pulled the pistol down below the level of the windowsill and relock the 1911. And as it turns out, it was just a fine gentleman asking me if I was lost or if I had broken down, and inquiring whether I wanted to use his cell phone. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember thanking him profusely and telling him no, that I just had some business and that I would be gone shortly. I spent the last hour of my assignment shaking from the adrenaline rush and trying to get my heart out of my throat. For the rest of that day and a good part of the night, I was wound up like a speed freak from the whole experience. And to this day, I often think about how close I came to shooting a totally innocent man. Had I pulled that trigger, that poor man's life would have ended, and mine and my family's life would have been irrevocably altered. And I'll never forget hearing the words that more than likely prevented me from making a gigantic mistake. Jumpin Jim saying situational awareness, situational awareness. Now my flying mentor, Jumpin Jim, God rest his soul, passed away in I think the mid-1980s. Yet decades later, he's still saving lives. And that's a hell of a guy. So I would like to conclude the story about the chainsaw with just 2 words: situational awareness. I'm quite certain that many of you out in the gun community, especially you military and law enforcement types, have many stories containing pearls of wisdom that could be beneficial to all of us. I invite and encourage all of you to share your stories so that we may learn from each other and hopefully avoid tragic mistakes. This is the Suburban Sentinel. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe. Safe shooting, everybody.